The knock came at 2:17 in the morning. I know the exact time because I'd been staring at the clock on my phone for the past hour, watching the battery crawl from 11% down to 8%, rationing whether I could afford to keep the screen on for warmth or let it die and save it for morning. The knock was 3 sharp raps on the passenger window, and the flashlight came right after, white and blinding and official in a way that made my stomach drop even though I hadn't done anything wrong, at least not anything illegal. I rolled down the window manually. The handle took 2 full rotations because something in the mechanism had been stripping for the past year and I'd never gotten around to fixing it. That felt like a metaphor for a lot of things in my life right then. Sir, the officer was young, couldn't have been more than 30, with that particular kind of jaw that comes from never having had to worry too hard about anything yet. We've had a complaint from the property manager. You've been parked here since yesterday afternoon. I have, I said. This is private property. The Kroger lot closes at midnight. I know, I said. I apologize. I'll move. He kept the flashlight on my face a second longer than necessary. I knew what he was seeing. A 63-year-old man in a Carhartt jacket that hadn't been washed in 2 weeks, sitting in a 2009 Ford F-250 that had rust along the wheel wells and a crack in the windshield I'd patched with clear packing tape. A paper bag from McDonald's on the passenger floor. A gym bag on the back seat with everything I owned in it. Sir, before you go, can I see your license and registration? I handed them over without argument. There was no point in arguing. I'd learned that lesson about 16 months ago, sitting across a conference table from my brother's attorney while my brother sat there in his $40 haircut and his Rolex, watching me sign away everything our father had spent 60 years building. The officer took my documents back to his cruiser. I watched the blue light from his laptop screen through his windshield, and I thought about my father. I thought about the last conversation we'd had, about 3 weeks before the stroke took him, sitting on the porch of the house on Mill Creek Road in Defiance, Ohio, drinking sweet tea and watching the sun go down behind the soybean fields. He'd put his hand on my knee, a thing he almost never did. He wasn't a touching man, and he'd said, I took care of you, James. I want you to know that. I took care of all of it. I hadn't known what he meant. I thought he was talking about the will. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about almost everything back then. Let me go back to the beginning. Because none of this makes sense without the beginning. My father built Holloway Fabrication out of a rented garage in Defiance, Ohio, in 1971. He made custom steel components for agricultural equipment. Nothing glamorous, nothing that would ever get him on the cover of a magazine, but honest work that fed a family and employed 37 people at its peak. My mother worked the books until she passed in 2003. After that, my brother and I split the duties. My brother handled sales and client relationships out of Columbus. I handled operations on the ground. I moved back to Defiance, lived 20 minutes from the plant, spent 16 years making sure the machines ran and the orders shipped and the workers had what they needed. My brother visited maybe 4 times a year. His name doesn't matter. I'll call him my brother, because that's what he was. Technically, legally, genetically, though I've had harder times applying that word to him since everything happened than I do calling that Kroger parking lot my bedroom. When my father's health started declining in 2021, my brother started coming around more, which I was glad about, at first. I thought it meant he cared. I thought it meant the family was pulling together. He brought his wife, a woman he'd married in 2018, 12 years his junior, who worked in commercial real estate in Columbus and who always seemed to be calculating the square footage of every room she walked into. She was perfectly polite to me. She was perfectly polite to everyone. The way a person is polite when they've already made a decision about you and they're just waiting for the paperwork to catch up. My father passed in March of 2022. Heart failure, then complications, then a Tuesday morning phone call that I'd been dreading for 2 years. I drove to the hospital in Toledo and I sat with him for an hour after. Just the two of us in a room that smelled like antiseptic and old coffee, and I said everything I needed to say even though he couldn't hear me anymore. That's the thing about goodbyes. The other person doesn't have to receive them for them to be real. The will reading was 2 weeks later. My father had left the business and the property on Mill Creek Road to both of us equally, split down the middle. His personal accounts, his vehicles, his tools. Everything divided fair. I thought that was the end of it. My brother's attorney, a man out of Columbus named Garrett, made contact that same week. Very cordial, very professional. There were, he explained, some structural complexities with the business that needed to be resolved before the estate could be settled. Tax implications, liability questions. He recommended that my brother and I come to an agreement, rather than letting the courts sort it out, because the courts would take 2 years and eat through most of the value in legal fees. I should have hired my own attorney immediately. Every person reading this who has ever been through anything like this is thinking that right now, and they're right. But I was 62 years old and I'd just buried my father, and I'd been sleeping 4 hours a night for the past 6 months, and my brother sat across from me at the kitchen table on Mill Creek Road and said, "James, I just want what's fair. Let's not make this ugly." And I believed him because he was my brother and I was tired, and because I had spent my entire adult life believing that the people who were supposed to be on your side were on your. The agreement they drew up gave my brother controlling interest in the business justified, Garrett explained, because my brother had been managing the client relationships, and the company would lose those clients without him. I received a buyout, $240,000 in the truck. The house on Mill Creek Road, the house my father built, the house I had lived 3 miles from for 16 years, went to my brother as part of the estate's primary asset package. I signed it. I signed it because I was tired and I was grieving, and because $240,000 felt like a real number to a man who had spent his career running a machine shop in northwestern Ohio. I signed it and I drove back to my apartment and I stared at the ceiling for about 3 hours, and then I thought, all right, start over. You're 62. Plenty of people start over at 62. It took 8 months for the money to mostly disappear. Not through recklessness, I want to be clear about that. My brother had assured me, in the months before the estate settled, that my position at the company was secure regardless of the ownership change. He'd said it 3 times. He'd said it in front of witnesses. What he had not done, and what I, not having an attorney, had not thought to require, was put it in writing. My termination letter arrived in November 2022, 4 months after I'd signed the agreement. Restructuring, it said. My role was being eliminated. I was given 2 weeks of severance. I tried to find work. I have to say that clearly because it matters. I tried. 37 years in manufacturing operations, facilities management, supply chain logistics. That experience counts for something when a company needs it. But the companies that needed it were not in Defiance, Ohio, and I was 62 with a truck that had a cracked windshield and a lease I couldn't keep paying. I sent out applications. I went to interviews. I drove to Toledo, to Fort Wayne, to Cleveland. Nothing came through fast enough. My landlord was patient longer than she had any obligation to be. When I finally had to leave the apartment in January, I packed everything that mattered into the gym bag on my back seat, and I drove to the Kroger parking lot on Sandusky Avenue because it was lit at night, and I'd read that big box parking lots were safer than side streets, and the security guard had nodded at me once without calling anyone, which I'd taken as a kind of quiet permission. That's where I was the night of the knock. The officer was in his cruiser for what felt like a long time, longer than it takes to run a license plate. I watched him in my side mirror, and I could see him on his radio, not his laptop anymore, his actual radio, which seemed unusual, and then he got out of the cruiser and he was walking back to my window, but he wasn't walking the way people walk when everything is routine. He was walking the way people walk when something has changed. He handed my license back through the window. He said, "Sir, can you step out of the vehicle for me? Am I in some kind of trouble?" "No, sir. I just need to ask you a few questions. Please step out." I got out of the truck. The January air in Defiance hits different at 2:30 in the morning. A specific, flat cold that comes up from the fields and goes right through whatever you're wearing. I stood there in my Carhartt, and the officer was looking at me with an expression that I could not read. Not suspicious, not hostile. Something else. Your name is James Robert Holloway? It is. Date of birth, March 14th? 1961? That's right. Sir, when I ran your license, it returned a notation from the Ohio Probate Registry. There's a flag on your file from 1989. He paused. Are you aware of a probate matter connected to your name? I told him I wasn't. My father's estate had been settled. There was no other probate matter that I knew of. He nodded slowly, like he was processing something. The flag indicates a pending claim under your name that has not been resolved. It's been in the system for he looked down at something in his hand 34 years. I stood there in the Kroger parking lot in the January cold and I tried to make sense of what he was telling me. 34 years, 1989. I was 28 in 1989. I was working my first real job, a plant manager position at a component supplier in Lima. I hadn't even met my ex-wife yet. What probate matter could possibly have been connected to me in 1989? The officer said, "There's a contact number in the notation, a law firm out of Columbus." The flag says he hesitated, and I noticed that his hand, holding the paper, wasn't quite steady. It says the matter is time-sensitive, and that Mr. Holloway should be contacted immediately upon location. Upon location. Like they'd been looking for me. Can I see that? I asked. He handed me the paper. Whitmore and Associates, Columbus, Ohio. A phone number with a 614 area code, and beneath it, in the clipped language of official notation, estate matter, Holloway, Carver mineral rights, estimated value, significant contact priority. I read the words estimated value significant twice. Then I read them a third time. The officer was watching me. Sir, are you all right? I told him I didn't know yet. I called the number the next morning from the McDonald's 2 blocks away, sitting at a corner table with a coffee I'd bought to justify using the Wi-Fi, my phone plugged into the wall outlet near the condiment station. The man who answered was named Warren Whitmore, and he was a probate and estate attorney. And when I told him my name, he went quiet for exactly 3 seconds, in a way that felt significant. Mr. Holloway, he said, we have been attempting to locate you for just over 3 years. He told me the story in pieces, and each piece made the coffee in front of me feel less and less real. In 1987, my father had purchased 42 acres of land in Guernsey County, Ohio, a rural tract about 2 hours southeast of Defiance, near the town of Cambridge. He'd bought it cheap at a county land auction, the way he occasionally did, holding parcels as long-term assets. What my father hadn't fully understood when he bought it, or had understood very well, depending on how you looked at it, was the geology. Guernsey County sits on the eastern edge of the Utica Shale Formation, one of the most productive natural gas plays in the United States. In 1989, my father had drafted a separate deed conveying the mineral rights to that 42 acres specifically, exclusively, and irrevocably to me. James Robert Holloway, his younger son. He'd filed it with the Guernsey County Recorder, had it registered with the Ohio Probate Registry under my name, and then, apparently, had never told me about it. The surface land had passed through the estate and gone to my brother in the settlement. My brother's attorney, Garrett, had reviewed the estate assets. The 42 acres in Guernsey County had been listed. What Garrett had either failed to find or had found and chosen not to mention was the 1989 mineral rights deed. The deed that was registered separately. The deed that sat in my name alone and had nothing to do with the will. When hydraulic fracturing made the Utica Shale economically viable around 2012, energy companies had begun acquiring mineral rights across eastern Ohio. By 2019, the 42 acres in Guernsey County had become extremely interesting to 3 different natural gas companies. Whitmore and Associates had been retained by one of them to locate the mineral rights holder and negotiate a lease. The mineral rights holder was me. I sat in the McDonald's with my phone getting warm against my ear, and I thought about my father on the porch on Mill Creek Road, his hand on my knee, saying, "I took care of you, James." Not, "I split things fairly." Not, "I left you half the business." He'd said, "I took care of you." He had known, I think, even then, that my brother was not the man I believed him to be. He had known in the way that fathers sometimes know things about their children that the children have not yet demonstrated in full. And he had done what he could, quietly, without drama, the same way he'd built everything else by preparing the ground long in advance and trusting that the harvest would come when it was needed. The estimated value of a 30-year mineral rights lease on the 42 acres, given current production rates and reserve estimates, was $4.2 million upfront and royalty payments projected at between $180,000 and $240,000 per year for the duration of the lease. I asked Warren Whitmore to repeat that. He did. I sat very still for what was probably 30 seconds. At the table next to me, a woman was explaining to a toddler why he couldn't have another hash brown. Somewhere behind the counter, someone was restocking napkins. The world was entirely ordinary, and I was sitting in the middle of it with $4.2 million and change, and the ghost of my father's voice in my ear. "Mr. Holloway," Warren said, "are you still there?" "I'm here," I said. "I'm here." He explained what would happen next. I would need to establish identity, sign the lease agreement, set up an account for the initial payment. The energy company was motivated to move quickly. They had adjacent leases already signed, and they wanted this parcel in the agreement before the drilling phase began in spring. If I was willing to work quickly, the initial payment could be processed within 60 days. I asked one more question before I hung up. I asked whether the mineral rights, deed the 1,989 deed, the one in my name alone, had ever been part of the estate proceedings. Had it been disclosed? Warren paused. "No," he said, carefully. "It was not disclosed in the estate filing. Would it have been required to be disclosed?" Another pause. "That would be a question for an estate litigation attorney," he said. "But my understanding is that assets held solely in your name would not be subject to the estate of another party. The deed was always yours, Mr. Holloway. It was simply a matter of finding you." I thanked him, and I set the phone down on the table, and I looked out the window at Sandusky Avenue in Defiance, Ohio, at the gray January sky and the empty parking lots and the Dollar General across the street. I thought about the last 16 months. The apartment, the job interviews, the sleeping bag I'd bought at Walmart, the specific humiliation of asking the Kroger security guard if it was okay to park overnight, framing it as a question about whether my truck would be towed rather than the real question, which was, is it safe for a 62-year-old man to sleep here? Will someone bother me? I thought about my brother in his Columbus house, a 6-bedroom colonial he'd bought with the proceeds from the business sale, the sale of the company our father had spent 30 years building. I thought about his wife with her real estate calculations and her perfect politeness. I thought about Garrett, the attorney, who had reviewed the estate assets and had either genuinely missed the 1,989 mineral rights, deed a matter of public record, filed with 2 separate county offices, or had not missed it at all. I've learned things about estate law in the past year that I wish I'd known 3 years ago. One of the things I've learned is that an attorney who assists a client in a transaction where a known material asset belonging to a third party is either concealed or left undisclosed may have exposure on several fronts: breach of fiduciary duty, fraud, civil conspiracy. I've also learned that Ohio has no statute of limitations on estate fraud when the concealment is found to be intentional. I went back to my truck. I sat in the driver's seat for a while without starting the engine. Then I took out my phone and I searched for estate litigation attorneys in Columbus, Ohio, and I started making a list. The next 60 days moved faster than any 60 days of my life since my 20s. Warren Whitmore's firm handled the mineral rights lease with the energy company. A straightforward process once my identity was established, and Warren was efficient and thorough in a way I appreciated enormously after everything I'd experienced on the other end of legal thoroughness. The initial payment of $4.2 million cleared into a new account on a Wednesday morning in late March, and I sat in a chair in Warren's conference room looking at the number on the wire confirmation, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Solid. Like I'd been standing on ice for 16 months and suddenly there was ground under me again. I didn't call my brother. I want to be honest about my reasons for that, because they were not entirely pure. Part of it was legal strategy. My litigation attorney had advised me not to make contact. But part of it was something simpler and less flattering. I wanted him to find out the way I'd found out things, without warning, in a way he hadn't prepared for. I wanted him to experience, just once, the specific feeling of the ground going out from under you. The estate fraud case was filed in Franklin County in April. The complaint named my brother, his wife, and Garrett. My litigation attorney, a woman named Patricia Osei, who had 22 years of experience and the particular calm of someone who has heard every possible version of human deception and long since stopped being surprised by any of it, described the case as unusually well documented. The 1,989 mineral rights deed was a matter of public record. The estate filing that omitted it was a matter of court record. Garrett's billing records obtained through discovery showed that he had conducted a Guernsey County property search in March 2022, 2 weeks before my brother and I signed the agreement. He had billed 4 hours to the search. The search would have returned the 1,989 deed. Patricia said, in her calm way, that this was a difficult thing to explain. My brother and his attorney settled in September. I'm not permitted to disclose the full terms, but I can tell you that the settlement included a payment to me that was, as Patricia put it, substantial. Garrett surrendered his law license as part of a separate agreement with the Ohio Bar. My brother sold the house in Columbus. I don't know where he's living now, and I've made a decision not to spend time thinking about it. The business Holloway Fabrication was sold to a regional manufacturing group in the settlement process. I didn't want to run it again. Too much water under that bridge. But I did ask, as a condition of the settlement, that the 37 employees who were still working there receive a retention bonus paid from the settlement proceeds. Patricia thought this was an unusual ask. I told her my father had employed those people and their families for decades and that some things are not just about money. She looked at me for a moment and then she wrote it into the agreement. I live in Defiance again now. I bought a house on Edgewood Drive, a white colonial with a porch that faces west, which means I can sit out there in the evenings and watch the sun go down the same way I used to watch it go down from my father's porch on Mill Creek Road. It's not the same. Nothing is ever quite the same after enough time has passed. But there's something to be said for sitting in a familiar sky, even a sky that has different land under it than it used to. I got the windshield fixed, I got the truck detailed. The woman at the detailing place found a parking receipt from the Kroger lot at the bottom of the center console and handed it to me without comment. I put it in my jacket pocket and I still have it. I keep it in the drawer of my bedside table, not as a reminder of the lowest point. I don't need a receipt for that. I remember every detail without help, but as a reminder of the particular night when a young officer's flashlight beam changed everything. He didn't know what he'd set in motion when he ran my license. I've thought about going back to find him, to explain, to say thank you. I haven't done it yet. I'm not sure what I would say. Maybe just, you knocked at 2:17 in the morning and you had no way of knowing that was exactly the right time. My father used to say that the ground tells you what it holds when it's ready, not before. He was talking about farming, about the soil on the land around Defiance. He was a practical man and he meant a practical thing. But I've turned that sentence over in my hands 100 times in the past year, and I keep finding new surfaces on it. He'd bought that land in Guernsey County for $14,000 at a county auction. He'd put my name on the mineral rights deed when I was 28 years old, just starting out, and he'd never told me because I think he didn't want it to change how I lived my life or what I worked for. He wanted me to build something real first. He wanted me to know who I was without the safety net, so that when the safety net appeared, I wouldn't confuse it for the thing that made me. I understand that now. I didn't for a long time. I was furious, if I'm honest, furious at him for not telling me, for leaving me in a position where my brother and his attorney could do what they did, for trusting in a 34-year-old piece of recorded paper rather than just having a conversation. But grief has a way of softening anger, given enough time. And when I sit on the porch on Edgewood Drive and watch the light go out of the sky, I can hear his voice the way I heard it that last evening on Mill Creek Road, quiet and certain and a little tired, saying, "I took care of you, James." He was right. He just did it in his own way, in his own time, the same way he did everything. There's a contractor named Bill who I've hired to do some work on the house, new gutters, some foundation repair, nothing glamorous. He's 61, works alone, drives a truck older than mine was. Last week he was on a ladder on the south side of the house, and I brought him out a coffee, and we stood there in the October morning and talked for a while about nothing in particular, the weather, the soybean harvest, whether the high school football team had a shot at regionals this year. Just two men talking in the ordinary way that men talk when they don't need anything from each other. Before he went back up the ladder, he looked at me and said, out of nowhere, "You seem like a man who's had some things happen to him." I thought about the Kroger parking lot. I thought about the flashlight. I thought about sitting in the McDonald's, hearing a number that didn't feel real. I thought about my father's hand on my knee. "I have," I said. He nodded, like that was the most natural thing in the world. "Seems like they worked out, though," he said. "They did," I said, "eventually." He went back up the ladder, and I went inside, and I stood in the kitchen of my house on Edgewood Drive, the house that belongs to me, in the town where I grew up, and I made another cup of coffee, and I stood at the window and watched the morning light come across the yard, and I thought, this is what the other side of it looks like. Not dramatic, not triumphant, just ordinary and warm, and entirely, quietly yours. That's all I wanted. That's what it was always about.